Gentlemen, dragons feature prominently in your novels and seem to play a role beyond simply being powerful beasts to be defeated or utilized. Can you talk about dragons both in the context of your worlds and perhaps their overall symbolic meaning?
Dragons are cool. I've always enjoyed writing about their dragons. I had a couple short stories back in the 70s, The Ice Dragon and The Way of Crossing Dragon, and so it's nice to return to them. I think in my books the dragons are powerful beasts. There are some secrets about the history of dragons and what they represent in the world of Westeros, and I'm going to reveal in later books.
Boy, dragons are cool, obviously. I started by, as many young boys are, becoming fascinated with dinosaurs. And I live in Montana, and we have one of the great dinosaur collections in the country, and in fact in the world. And so I would read about dinosaurs and stuff, and then when I started reading fantasy, to me, dragons were like, just another kind of dinosaur in a certain way. And I love the mythology. I love the symbology that dragons hold in so many stories throughout history. The fact that the dragons often represent primal forces within the world, pestilence or famine or evil of one kind, or in the Eastern tradition, more good things. Dragons are just a wonderful thing to have in a story. They provide so many rich opportunities for writing. And of course, in my case, I wanted to have a dragon, the dragon Saphira, who's paired with Aragon. And I think that was a little bit of wish fulfillment to have a young character who has a best friend who, knows everything he's feeling and can help him, and if he doesn't like someone, can eat him. So it was a nice device in the beginning, and of course the dragons have played a huge role since then in my stories.
I'd like to move on to another question now. Both of you depict a diverse range of fiction, characters in your fiction. Mr. Martin, your fiction is largely concerned with human beings, and your diversity is one of culture. Whereas Mr. Paolini, your work features various fantastic species beyond humanity. In both of your cases, how do you create these distinct groups, and how do you make them more believable to the reader?
Well, as you say, most of my characters are human, just of different cultures. And although they're fantasy cultures, I try to base them on history. I read a lot of history and historical fiction and memoirs of medieval period and periods before the Dark Ages and so forth. And you read about a culture, like my Dothraki, for example, who are nomadic, steppe-dwelling horse people. Certainly they're strongly influenced by the Mongols, but they're not just the Mongols with the name rubbed off. They have a bit of the Mongols and a bit of the Huns and a bit of the Alans and the other steppe people, also a bit of the Amerindian horse cultures like the Cheyenne and the Sioux. And I mix all those together, and then I also add some fantasy elements that I think make them a little uniquely my own and make them a little different from any of the real life groups. But I think a solid grounding in real history is the important thing. The other thing I also try to do is to create a range of characters in any of these peoples to reflect human diversities and the fact that every group has its good people and bad people and weak people and strong people. With my cultures, I kind of like to mix it up a little, and you have the predominant cultural norms, but you also have the outliers and the dissidents and the people who don't quite fit that.
I think in the case of writing fantastical, imaginary creatures, it's basically the same approach, but you take it a little bit further because some of the differences actually are inherently, biologically based in that case. But you do have to have the outliers. You fall in the case of, an all evil, all good species. In fact, that's one reason why in my own books I have the Urgles, who are, large, scary monsters with horns on their heads. And I started with them playing a very stereotypical role of the evil monsters that scares the hero and everyone hates them. And I twisted it around. I ended up having them become allies because from their point of view, the Urgles' point of view, what they're doing is perfectly reasonable. And they're not evil, they're just different. And sometimes that difference leads them to killing humans, and sometimes it leads them to helping humans. And to me, that leads to much more interesting fiction. It helps avoid the moral problem of, again, saying, it's okay to kill an entire race just because they're inherently bad. And that leads to some very dangerous types of fiction, I think.
Something I've noticed both in your own work and as well as that of many contemporary fantasy authors is that the good guys don't always win. And I wanted to ask you if this is something reflective of your own real life experiences or simply a matter of building drama or what?
I know there's an appetite on the part of many readers for what you could call comfort fiction, where you can count on the hero prevailing at the end of the day, no matter how much difficulty he gets in, and for the villain getting his just desserts. But it's just not the fiction I'm interested in writing. I'm interested in doing something that kind of shakes up my readers a little more and involves them on a emotional level and makes them afraid and makes them cry and makes them weak with relief because the hero did manage to survive this particular thing. And to do that, you have to establish early on that you're playing for keeps, and that it's a dangerous world you're writing about, and that the peril the characters are in is actual, real peril that has teeth, and they may not survive this next one.
I actually found it rather amusing that you and I got paired together on both a panel and now this interview, considering that you're busy deconstructing the exact kind of fantasy that I'm busy writing. And I think you're right, though. I think it's a question of temperament, really. I mean,
Right.
What you tend to be drawn toward. I mean, when I was 15, 14 and getting into fantasy, for me, it was the big romantic epic fantasies. And I set out to try to, pay tribute and homage to those things that I loved. And of course in those, the hero prevails but as you said, along the way, you have to put your characters in enough danger that the readers, at least, can think, well, maybe there's a chance your characters are not going to survive. And it's a fine line. I mean, ultimately, if you look back in history, the stories that continue to appeal over the centuries tend to be ones of, great hardship and great struggle, but in the end, there is a reward for the characters. They do accomplish something,
I wanted to talk about magic now. Magic is represented in different ways in your books. In the Inheritance cycle, it's a good bit more common, whereas in A Song of Ice and Fire, it seems like it's diminished, at least at first. What led you guys to make these creative decisions?
I actually debated it very early on when I was doing Game of Thrones, having no magic whatsoever, just making it something in the vein of Ellen Kushner's Swords Point, which is a fantasy, but in a world without magic. It's basically an alternate history novel about history that never happened in lands that never existed, but it's musketeers and sword fights and kings and all that. It's got all the great stuff, and I thought of going that direction, but I said no, fantasy should have some magic in it. And I Tolkien again is my god and my model there. And if you actually study Lord of the Rings, although Middle Earth is suffused with a great sense of magic, there's very little on-stage magic. There's dragons and Balrogs and beasts, and there's the various races. But Gandalf, although identified as a wizard, does very little wizardry, and that just seemed to me the perfect balance. A little magic, because I think magic is something you have to handle very carefully in fantasy.
I spent a lot of time thinking about this before I started Aragon, because I basically saw the two camps when I started writing, one being Tolkien's more almost symbolic or mythic approach to the magic, where it's never explained how it works, and as you said, it's what you see of it is very slight, and you do get the sense that when it is used, it comes at a great personal cost. It's even for Gandalf, it's not an easy thing to use magic. And then on the other hand, you have, I would guess you could almost say more scientific approaches to magic, where it's a system with lots of spells and codes and, practices that you explore in order to control the magic. And again, for me, it was a question of temperament. I like to know how and why something works. And so I decided that, I was going to go with the more scientific approach. I was going to make one logical leap, and that logical leap was to believe that the characters in my world somehow had some physical structure in their brains that would allow some of them to manipulate energy in the world around them. And that's what magic was. And that could be done with or without the structure of language.
I'd like to ask you if either of you have ever had a character that went off the rails, that you thought it'd go one way and then it developed another way completely under your direction.
I've had minor characters who kind of become uppity and sort of they were just supposed to come on and serve dinner, but suddenly they're hanging around and offering wisecracks, and they become an important part of the secondary cast there. Saying, no, I'm more interesting than that. I'm going to hang around for a while. But mostly my characters stay on the rails, or else I slap them around.
I think the only times my characters go off the rails is when I'm sticking with an earlier preconception of them, and it's taken me a little while to realize that the character has actually changed and isn't that original person anymore. And then I'm trying to force them to do something that they no longer would do. And in that case, it's not really a case of the character going off the rails as the author going off the rails, and just having to realize, okay, no, he's not going to become king, or he's not going to kill the villain, or he's not going to do this, that, or other. He really would do something else.
I know that writers or any kind of creative person really doesn't work in a vacuum, and certainly history and mythology and the work of other authors has influenced your work. I'd like to ask if your personal history, the things you've experienced in your life, as well as history generally, that of our culture and the world at large, has influenced your work in what way specifically?
Well, yeah, I mean, someone once said that, all writers are writing about themselves all the time. And that's obviously a exaggeration, but there's a nugget of truth there, too. I mean, our own experiences, particularly our emotional experiences, are fodder for the mill. And we in science fiction and fantasy, we're writing things set on distant planets and in other epochs of time and space, and about aliens and dragons and kings and all that. So, but the best stuff still has our own life and our own way of viewing the world and human beings and human relationships at the core of it. I think that's what provides the emotional power that that drives it.
Well, I mean, my work is intensely autobiographical in many ways, mainly because I started writing at the age I did, and my main character was very close to me, at least in the beginning. I mean, I was heavily influenced by, many of the sources that have influenced other fantasy authors, Beowulf, a lot of the Nordic, Scandinavian stuff. Macbeth was a primary influence on me, and a lot of this stuff. And I do, I put myself into my work.
One final question. Both of your series are winding down, maybe soon, maybe later.
Winding down. I have 2 more 1,500-page books to write. 3,000 more pages. No, it's not winding down for me, not for years to come.
Well, I'd still like to ask, what's it like to say goodbye to a cast of characters you've known so well? And Mr. Martin, I know yours might be a little bit longer away from Mr. Paolini's, but I'd still like your thoughts on that, and surely you've had that experience before.
Parting is such sweet sorrow, as the Bard of Avon said. I expect that will be true. When I reach the end, it will be sad to think that I'm never going to write about these people. But then again, by then I may have killed them all. So I'll just be walking away from their graves in the icy hell that the world has become.
I mean, for me, this year makes the 12th year I've been working on this series. And, I started when I was 15, and most people do not stay working on the same thing from when they were 15 to 27. And so it's been an incredibly immersive and transformative experience for both me and my family. And yeah, I mean, it was really tough saying goodbye. I mean, It was one of the things where I got the last chapter. It was one of those things where you just get a rush of emotion through your body, and it's like, wow, my life is about to change now. If you have the time, there's a question I'd like to ask you. And I know this is a difficult question. What is it that really drives you to write? I mean, what is it about? Is it the stories, the character? I mean, what is it, the one thing that gets you to the desk every single day, the reason you want to tell these stories, or any stories in general?
I don't know. That's a good question, and I'm not sure I know the answer. I've written all my life. I've written even when I was a kid in grade school, writing little monster stories and then giving dramatic readings to the other kids in the projects, I love their reactions. I love telling a story and seeing people, gasp when the monster comes on, or tear up when something sad happens, or getting involved in it. And also, when I write, to some extent, I'm living the adventures. So my own life is one, at least imaginatively, of climbing mountains and fighting in battles and sailing distant seas and visiting wonderful places, at least in my imagination. I can't comprehend me ever retiring as long as I'm still healthy about to write. I mean, no matter how successful or unsuccessful I become, whether I had $1 billion or whether I had lost my audience and my books were now unpublishable, I still think I'd continue to write them because there's something in me that's just driven to write.
I'd like to thank both of you for your time and participation.
Thank you. I thought that was a great answer. And
Thank you
for having us.